Hi, Adam here with Cold Open at the start of this episode of Revolutions of Our Time. As I mentioned on a previous episode, we'd had some audio issues with this one, and there's a section in the middle which has been ripped from the Zoom audio. So the audio is a little bit janky throughout this episode. We nevertheless hope you enjoy it and apologise for the poor quality and are working to make sure it's better in the future. The start and end of any particularly janky audio will be indicated with a guitar strum. Content warning, this episode discusses fiction and contains references to assault and sexual violence within the context of that fiction. Sam, what is the difference between sci-fi and fantasy?
Elves versus aliens, I guess?
That is up there, but for the purposes of this podcast, fantasy is when your novel is an allegory for the War of the Roses, and sci-fi is when your novel is an allegory for the Vietnam War.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense.
Welcome back to Revolutions of Our Time, a podcast where we look at revolutions, protests, disobedience, and try to tease out tools for how we can fight the good fight. My name's Adam, and with me, as always, is a man who I know to be very familiar with the genre of fantasy, but whose commitment to sci-fi I am not sure of. Sam, how are you doing today?
You caught me. I am indeed a fantasy guy over a sci-fi guy. I'm a swords and sandals guy over a sci-fi guy as well. But today I'm doing good. I mean, politically speaking, it's a dumpster fire out there, but we do what we can here. Yeah, we do what we can in this small recording studio to brighten that up.
As of recording, yesterday, Grok AI declared itself Mecha Hitler, unprompted, so that's a fun timeline that we're living in.
Yeah, indeed.
This is a bit of a different episode for us, because unlike in previous episodes where we have looked at existing protest and revolutionary movements, in this episode we're going to actually have a look at a fictional rebellion, a fictional protest from a sci-fi novel. The word for world is Forest by Ursula K. Guin. But first, some congratulations are in order. As far as I can tell, this may end up being slightly different, but the release date for this podcast will be around the 28th of July, and on this day, we must issue our congratulations to Peru, who gained independence from Spain on the 28th of July, 1821, as declared by Jose de San Martin. Now, the website in which I was reading up on the Peruvian Independence Day was called peruhop.com,
Okay.
and they claim that Jose de San Martin was the most famous Latin American liberator apart from Simón Bolívar. I think probably Che Guevara is more famous than both of them, but but perhaps not in Latin America, and perhaps that's a different kind of independence.
Depends how you define Latin America. But yeah, when I think of that time in history, I definitely think of Bolivar and no one else. So that's exciting that there was another revolution around the same time period that did not involve him.
Yeah, well, they were linked together. I did not take extensive notes on this, but I remember reading that they sort of encountered each other in their movements.
Just gave a subtle nod, from over the mountains. Good job.
So, perhaps something like that. Jose de San Martin was a soldier, fought against France in the Peninsular War, which was part of the Napoleonic Wars, and then basically did not relinquish control of the army and used it to liberate Argentina, Chile, and Peru. So, congratulations to Jose de San Martin and the nation of Peru.
Congrats. Viva Peru. Former home of Pope Leo, as we know.
Yeah, Viva Peru. So, as I mentioned, Sam, this episode is a little different in that we're not talking about a real protest. We are talking about a fictional one. This is a bit of an experimental structure. We're trying to work out the utility of speaking about fictional worlds, and I wonder if you have any thoughts right at the top of the episode about that utility. Why might we be talking about fiction in our podcast about history and current events?
Yeah, my brain, which has been trained to study history for many years now, is quite nervous and scared for this episode, but also excited. I think Adam will soon hear that I have memorized a lot of facts about the world we live in, and as a result had to push out a lot of the literature I read in high school in order to make room. But why might fiction be useful in analyzing protest or revolution? I think fiction can speak a different language and reach a different people that need to hear that message. I think fiction can be a tool in an oppressive society. For example, if you are not allowed to speak outright against your government, you might be able to get away with that in an allegorical book because there's some deniability in having it be a fictional story and not exactly a critique on the regime.
Yeah, I agree. I think it can serve that purpose for sure. I also think that fiction can serve as something of a model in the same way that you have models in economics which supply extremely complex processes. By looking at fiction, we can create a model for different experiences of the world, different things that take place in our lives, strip away some of the details that are an inherent part of life, but which make constructing a narrative complicated.
I think also, like, constructing a model can go both ways. I think institutions have used fiction to construct a model citizen. I think of the U.S. founding fathers and the mythos behind them. They were just people. They were individuals with flaws. But if you were a third grader in America, you would think that George Washington was Captain America, basically. And,
right.
I could not tell a lie, wherever that came from, like they're teaching the American citizenry how to be, what to look up to, and who better to inspire the youth than George Washington himself, I guess.
Yeah, to sum up another element of why fiction can be good to look at, I have a quote for you to read here.
Fantasy is an exercise bicycle for the mind. It might not take you anywhere, but it tones up the muscles that can. Sir Terry Pratchett. Oh.
Yeah.
Love that guy.
He's great, yeah. And has been dead long enough that I think if he was going to be cancelled, it would have happened by now. So.
Yeah, just like Mr. Rogers. We're in the clear.
I think we're in the clear. So that's maybe something that we're gonna try and do today. We're gonna tone up the imaginative muscles of our mind. We're gonna try and distill things to its core elements, see what useful remains, and maybe see if we can use fiction as a tool for imagining other ways of being, other ways of acting.
I think in our preseason you mentioned our political ideology, being further left on the political spectrum than most institutionalized parties in the West. You used the phrase imagining a different way of organizing or imagining a different world we can live in. And I think fiction is that, right? Fiction is what if the world was more like this or more like that. So I'm excited. I'm excited to hear about how we can explore and connect the dots here.
Yeah. You mentioned a few minutes ago that you're a fantasy guy. Have you engaged with a lot of sci-fi?
Not through literature, unfortunately, which I think I probably would like. But now mostly through video games and through film and TV. That's mainly my sci-fi.
I think that still counts. I don't think it makes a huge difference for the purposes of what we're talking about, whether you've read written words or played video games or watched films. And what we are going to be talking about is a book, a novella, by legendary sci-fi author Ursula K. Le Guin. I don't know if you've heard of Ursula Le Guin.
Did she have another book as well that was famous?
She's written several books.
Yeah.
In fact, she wrote more than 20 novels, 100 short stories, a dozen volumes of poetry, and 13 children's books throughout her life. She wrote The Dispossessed, she wrote The Left Hand of Darkness, she wrote the Athshe saga. Those are her most famous works.
Oh yeah, the Dispossessed was the one that I was reading about in preparation for this podcast.
Okay. Well, we'll talk about that very briefly. She was a very influential author. She's an American author, born in 1929 to Theodora Kroeber, who was an author, and Alfred Louis Kroeber, who was an anthropologist in Berkeley, California. She won 8 Nebula Awards, 6 Hugo Awards, various other awards. She wrote largely imaginative fiction, exploring themes of gender and sexuality and different political systems. Her influences include cultural anthropology, Taoism, the works of Carl Jung, and she died in 2018 at the age of 88 and was very influential to lots of authors. She was very popular. And the particular book that we're going to be looking at is called The Word for World is Forest. Do you know anything about this book, Sam?
Just from hearing you sing its praises over the years, but I haven't checked it out yet. I need to, based on its influence on you that I know it has.
Yeah, well, I think it's a wonderful book, and just a warning for the listener, we will be dipping into spoiler territory here. It's hard to talk about a 150-page book without having at least some element of spoilers there.
And the fact that I didn't read it before this episode is just for you, listener, as well. So that way, it's not just two guys talking about a book we know. I'm bringing us all along for the ride.
Exactly. Although next time we try this, maybe we'll both engage with the source material. We'll see. The Word for World is Forest is a sci-fi book. But really, it's a book about colonialism on its sort of interplanetary level. A little bit of context for this series. It's part of a series of books called the Hainish Cycle. Ursula K wrote two main series that she is known for, the Athshe Chronicles, which is a fantasy series, and the Hainish Cycle. And this is a series of books which are loosely related to each other. They're set in the same universe. There's some overlap, but jumps around chronologically and doesn't necessarily need to be read in order.
So it's a Terry Pratchett situation.
Even less so, because Terry Pratchett does have through lines through the different sub series in his works, but this one, it's more tenuous than that.
Okay.
At least there are 7 novels. I've read 3 of those, and of those 3, they don't. There's very little overlap between them. Some of the same ideas, some of the same technologies, some of the same sort of arm's length bodies are mentioned.
Okay.
This is a series in which humans did not originate on Earth, but rather another planet called Hain. And it's at a time when these different human species from different human planets are interacting with each other. Sometimes these humans have evolved slightly different traits, but are still human, and they're exploring the galaxy. The Word for World is Forest takes place on a planet called Athshe, which is also known as New Tahiti, which is also known as World 41 by the humans coming from Earth. And a thing about sci-fi, which is also a thing about fantasy, is that the names can be quite hard to deal with. So Athshe is Athshe.
It's like reading Chinese history if you're from the West, or vice versa. I've been told by Chinese people that studying English history is immensely confusing because it's like, oh, it's James I of England, aka James VI of Scotland, and he had all these names that are the same.
Well, I think George R. R. Martin spoke about this in that he gives his characters the same names because if you read English history, they're called George or Henry or
John,
James or John, right?
Yeah.
These are the names that existed at the time.
It makes sense if you're writing a fiction based on history that people would name themselves or their kids after great people or their fathers. So
yeah, it makes sense. It doesn't necessarily make it easy to read.
No.
but it does. The Word for World is Forest takes place on Athshe, and Athshe is a world that is being settled by humans from Earth, Terrans as they're often called. You see this in sci-fi quite a lot where humans from Earth are called Terran because it sounds a lot cooler than Earthling.
They're not called dirtlings. It all means the same thing, right?
I suppose it does, yeah. Dirtlings, I like that. Humans settle on New Tahiti in order to log the trees on this planet. It's a beautiful planet covered in trees. Well, it's mostly covered in water, but there are some big islands covered in trees. And back on Earth, wood is now more valuable than gold. The whole planet has been deforested.
Dang.
The story is told from 3 perspectives.
So it's Scotland. It's based on Scotland, essentially, right?
Well, it is very explicitly based on the Vietnam War. There is an author's note in the beginning in which Ursula K talks about writing this in the sort of wake of the Vietnam War. It was first published as part of an anthology in the 1960s, and then in the early 1970s released as a standalone novel.
Okay.
It is told from 3 perspectives. Selva, who is a native Athshean, Lyubov, who is an anthropologist who's part of this colonial mission, and Captain Davidson, who is a soldier on this colonial posting and is a real nasty piece of work. It's very explicitly about the Vietnam War. In fact, the commanding officer on Athshe is called Colonel Dong, Vietnamese name, and even the Vietnam War is explicitly referenced in the story itself as well as in the author's note. I have this quote here from the penultimate chapter of the book.
You can't disable a guerrilla-type structure with bombs. It's been proved. In fact, my own part of the world where I was born proved it about 30 years fighting off major superpowers, one after the other, in the 20th century.
So that is Colonel Dong who is writing about that there.
What year does this book take place?
Unclear. Distant future.
Got it.
Distant future.
Okay. Does the story beats follow? I mean, based on your character structure you gave me, I'm getting a Dances with Wolves Avatar vibe, which Avatar just copied Dances with Wolves in space. Someone embedded within the colonizer goes forth and learns about the natives and then sympathizes with the natives and then fights with the natives against their original country, which is the oppressor.
Not quite.
Okay, good to hear that it's original.
Lyubov is sympathetic to the Athshean cause, doesn't actively fight with. The Terrans and the Athsheans are clearly of the same origin, but they are different. The Terrans, especially Captain Davidson, can't seem to decide whether the Athsheans are human or not, and are inconsistent in their beliefs around them. They describe them as humanoid, but not human often. They are around a meter tall, maybe slightly taller, and their body is covered in green fur. In fact, the original title of the book was Little Green Men, sort of a reference to that classic sci-fi trope. In an introduction written by Ken MacLeod, there were two introductions to the book, one written by Ursula Guin and one by Ken MacLeod. Ken MacLeod describes the Terran perception of the Athsheans as just strong enough to be slaves, too weak to be a threat. The Terrans refer to Athsheans as creatures in a quite derogatory way, and sometimes will describe them as animals, yet they will keep them as slaves and will rape Athshean women.
This descriptor, if I'm putting my history hat back on, gives me Scramble for Africa vibes, and how the Europeans in the 1800s really abused the continent of Africa. And this language in particular reminds me of like the Belgian Congo and the Pygmies that live there as well, which I'm guessing she drew some parallel from that.
Quite possibly, and it's funny you say that because especially as I was writing up the notes for this, the character of Captain Davidson really reminded me of Kurtz from Heart of Darkness, which is about the Belgian Congo and the ivory trade there. In fact, I have this quote from page 9 of the story from Captain Davidson's perspective. This is a slightly longer quote. More quotes in this episode because it is a novel that we're talking about, or a novella.
Get enough humans here, build machines and robots, make farms and cities, and nobody would need the creatures anymore. And a good thing too, for this world, New Tahiti was literally made for men. Cleaned up and cleaned out, the dark forest cut down for open fields of grain, primeval murk and savagery and ignorance wiped out. It would be a paradise, a real Eden, a better world than a worn-out earth. And it would be his world, for that's what Don Davidson was, way down deep inside him, a world tamer. He wasn't a boastful man, but he knew his own size. It just happened to be the way he was. He knew what he wanted and how to get it, and he always got it.
So that's a pretty good introduction to the character of Captain Davidson. The Athsheans, for their part, do recognize the Terrans as the same as them, humans, as they call them in their understanding.
So does Bernie Sanders.
But the Athsheans believe the Terrans to be somewhere between being children and insane, because the Terrans have no control over their dreams. This is something that is pretty interesting about the Athshean characters, the Athshean humans. They have dream technology down to a fine art or a fine science. They can dream whilst they're awake, and they use dreaming as a way to dissolve the barrier between the conscious and subconscious mind. And it's a little bit confusing, but I suppose it's supposed to be, because we as Terrans cannot access this technology. The Athsheans describe the humans from Terra as dreaming as children do, only in sleep. But it is this division between the dreaming world and the waking world that allow them to live in such harmony with the world around them. And they understand that the Terrans are only as different from them as a red deer is from a grey deer. Now, the novel starts with a conversation between Captain Davidson and Lyubov, who is an anthropologist attached to this colonial posting studying the Athshean people. And Lyubov is trying to convince Davidson to stop his men from hunting the deer on this planet, which is forbidden by the colonial authority back on Earth. And Lyubov points out that the men on the planet have every pleasure available to them. They have all the entertainment that's been made in the past 100 years from Earth. They have drugs, they have sports, there are women being brought from Earth to New Tahiti, to Athshe, for them to enjoy. So why do they need to hunt the deer? And Davidson sort of dismisses Lyubov as being naive about the needs of soldiers on these foreign planets. Towards the end of the first chapter, Captain Davidson heads to the central posting on this planet, headquarters of the colony, to basically make use of these women who are being brought from Earth. And when he returns to the camp that he's been living on, Camp Smith, he finds that it has been destroyed by the Athsheans. At first, he can't believe this, because Lyubov, the anthropologist, pointed out that Athsheans are non-aggressive, non-violent, and that was always true. The perspective of the novel then shifts in the next chapter to Selva, who is the main Athshean on the story. Selva was a servant, a slave, effectively, of Captain Davidson, a slave who was in the role of personal servant or butler. And Selva was, I suppose you'd say, radicalized after his wife was murdered by being raped by Captain Davidson. Mm. And so Selva led this first armed insurrection against the humans on Athshe. And Selva effectively communicates that the human beings, the Terrans, are insane. And he has a conversation with these other Athsheans from another society about what he's encountered with the Terrans that he meets on this planet. And they can't understand it. So there is a passage here. So Selva is talking to the other Athsheans and says, "I'm not raving, this is true fact and dream. There were 200 humans at Kelmadeva, and they are dead. We killed them. We killed them as if they were not men. So will they not in turn do the same?" And then the Athsheans say, "This doesn't happen in the world. This sounds like a fever dream." And another Athshean says, "The world is always new, however old its roots, Selva. How is it with these creatures then? They look like men and talk like men. Are they not men? I don't know. Do men kill except in madness? Does any beast kill its own kind? Only the insects. The humans kill us as lightly as we kill snakes. The ones who taught me said that they kill one another in quarrels and also in groups, like ants fighting. I haven't seen that, but I don't know who will spare one who asks life. They will strike a bowed neck. I've seen it. There is a wish to kill in them, and therefore I saw it fit to put them to death." "All men's dreams," said Coromena, cross-legged in the shadow, "will be changed. They will never be the same again. I shall never again walk the path I came with you yesterday, the way up from the Willow Grove that I've walked all my life." So this is basically pointing out that killing for quarreling, killing their own species, is a new idea to the Athsheans that has been introduced by the humans from Terra. And this is something that's really a theme from the book, which is how the colonized is changed by the arrival of the colonizers. How the colonization corrupts not only the colonizers, but the colonized as well.
Now, I was just gonna ask how are you gonna bring this back to protest and revolution? But you did it. It took a while, but you brought us there. So
Yeah, and the rest of the story sort of follows the continued interaction between the Athsheans led by Selva and by Captain Davidson. Shortly
and
after them, please.
before we move on to that, I guess, do you have any examples you can think of I mean, you studied anthropology, so have
Mhm.
you noticed any instances in our world where that has been true, where a colonized people group have fundamentally changed in principle due to the conditions they were put in?
Yeah, I think that happens pretty inevitably in instances of colonization. I mean, and in some ways more troubling than others. If you look at indigenous Americans, when indigenous Americans obtained rifles from Europeans, the buffalo population started to decline massively because they were able to use these sort of violent technologies from
And
Europe.
horses too.
And horses, yeah. Which is funny because they were originally from North America, then died out in North America and came back. Health being impacted in First Nations people in Canada, largely due to residential schools and the forced discontinuation of indigenous diets. There are, I mean, whole nations that were created by colonized, right? Like, if you look at, well, really any colonized country, Nigeria, for example, there are hundreds of languages in Nigeria. The idea of a Nigerian was created basically whole cloth by the British. And even the ways in which people seek to present themselves. In China, in rural parts of China, there, I can't remember the specific uh, ethnic group that I was reading about this with, but there was a group that would selectively present themselves as different ethnicities from within China based on which had the most perks available to it at that time. One time there might be Han, another time there might be another group, depending on what sort of grants were available.
I don't remember the name, but I think we've talked about it before. They're on the border
Yeah.
of like Vietnam and China, where they, in history, they've kind of bounced back and forth on their identity.
Exactly. So some of the ways in which people change through the colonial interactions are benign, and some of them are profound. But the rest of the book is effectively about this continued interaction. The massacre on Camp Smith coincides with the arrival of a ship back from Earth, in which there are emissaries, and things have changed back on the homeworld in the time that the colonists have been on this planet. They are 27 light years from Earth, and so each message would take 27 years to get there each way. So 54 years for a one back and forth communication on this planet.
Is it one of those sci-fi where they like freeze the people on the ship, or do they live a full life like
they
at normal time on the ship?
Frozen on the ship, but at the time when these emissaries arrive, a new technology has been developed which allows for instantaneous communication across any distance. So they're saying things have changed. Earth is now part of the League of Worlds. We have this instantaneous communication. The conditions on this colony are completely unacceptable. You have to minimize contact with the Athsheans. Forced labor is absolutely forbidden, and voluntary labor is strongly, strongly discouraged, is basically what they say. Davidson blames Lyubov for saying that the Athsheans are non-violent, but this does appear to be a new phenomena for the Athsheans. Davidson completely ignores this message from the Colonial Bureau and decides that the Athsheans have to be exterminated, and leads these secret raiding parties at night in order to attack Athshean towns. He believes them to be a sort of plague on the colony. And for a while, this was something that I didn't fully know how to reconcile about the book, because it seemed to me that the way it was presented was that the Colonial Bureau back on Earth, back on Terra, didn't really didn't approve of the kinds of abuse that were going on planet, and that they weren't really a part of the project, and they were quite innocently coming for wood, as innocent as that can be, and didn't want to disturb the Athshean population too much. And Davidson was really the nasty brute who was pushing all of that oppression. And I wondered why Le Guin had made that choice to write it in that way. Then reading another passage, which was from the perspective of Captain Dong, I think I understood a little bit more about why she had written it in this way. And I think it is to do with talking about sort of the banality of evil and how dangerous choosing the lesser evil, the lib option, can be sometimes. I have another quote for you here from the perspective of Captain Dong.
Can you remind us who Captain Dong is again?
Captain Dong is the commanding officer on Athshe, who is technically in charge of Colonel Dong is the commander of Captain Davidson.
Okay. Got it. Okay. He'd been careful to keep on the right side of HQ, objecting only to extreme causes of brutality against the natives, using persuasion, not defiance, and conserving what shred of power and influence he had. He could not prevent the exploitation of the Athsheans. It was much worse than his training had led him to expect, but he could do little about it here and now. His reports to the administration and to the Committee on Rights might, after the round trip of 54 years, have some effect. Terra might even decide that the open colony policy for Athshe was a bad mistake. Better 54 years late than never. If he lost the tolerance of his superiors here, they would censor or invalidate his reports, and there would be no hope at all.
So this is an instance of Colonel Dong not acting because he is hoping to curry favor with those superiors who are too far away, too removed to actually have an impact on it anyway, whilst people are suffering in the here and now.
So, I mean, this was written in the 70s, right?
It was first written in the 60s, but published
60s.
as standalone in the 70s.
Yeah. I guess, could you explain the parallel of the time that is being alluded to here? And I know you chose it for a reason now to highlight. Can you explain a parallel now that you're thinking of as you're describing this type of situation?
Sure. Yeah. So this was written in the early years of the Vietnam War. Vietnam War was a long war, of course, but I think 68 was when this first came out. Vietnam War started 65, was it?
I mean, America had been in Vietnam for a lot longer than that, but yeah.
Sure, officially. And so it's written in the context of that, where there are sort of reformers who are trying to operate on the traditional levers of power in quote unquote good faith and go through the official channels, flawed as they are, in order to try and make changes in that way. But ultimately, whilst that's going on, they're being ignored, and there's lots of destruction that's going on, either because those in power are not interested or because they are willfully ignorant of what's going on. You aware of the concept of a philosophical razor?
I've heard the term. You want to explain it for the audience?
This is basically like a simple idea in philosophy that's useful in day-to-day life. I'm sure that's not the actual definition of it, but that is practically what it means. And Hanlon's razor is the idea that you should never attribute to malice that which can be adequately explained by stupidity. But there is an important corollary to that, which is that sufficiently advanced ignorance is indistinguishable from malice. So even if the high-ups were ignorant of the things that were going on in the ground in Vietnam, or whichever colonial blunder it might have been, then that is at this point indistinguishable from malice.
Okay.
And I think there's something of that going on there, and I think it is much the same today. I'm reminded specifically of the Democrats right now in the United States, who they talk, well, not even a particularly big game anti-Trump, but they say vote for us and we can claw back power in another 3.5 years from him. I believe Chuck Schumer, his big contribution fighting against the Big Beautiful Bill was to rename it the Big Ugly Bill. Wasn't entirely sure if that was real, even by Democrat standards, but it does seem to have been. And I think that that when I read this passage, I was like, oh, this is why the colonial authority appear benign at a glance, because they are too removed from the reality to have an impact anyway, and maybe they don't want to know about what's going on there.
Yeah, I think there was a reflection of that in the UK in the past few weeks
as well,
where like Glastonbury kind of put Palestine front and center at this big stage that everyone in the UK was paying attention to at the time, even being on free television broadcasts like every home. And the Labour Party really had a sense of no, it's the kids who are wrong.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So the rest of the novel plays out the battles between Captain Davidson and between Selva, and eventually Captain Davidson is captured by Selva and left on the island that has been completely deforested by humans. And Selva tells Davidson that he's taught the Athshins the gift of murder, but that he won't kill Davidson at this time because they too are giving him a gift. The Terran gift was killing, the Athshin gift was not killing. 3 years later, the Terran ships return and take the surviving colonists off the planet, promising not to return except as observers and scientists. For me, the takeaway of this is that resistance comes at a cost, right? And how do we determine what cost we can bear, what that cost should be? It also suggests to me that tools of domination remain, if not the same, then certainly there are patterns in tools of domination. Reductionism is one of them from the colonial authority. The forest, which is of course the world in this book, the word for world is forest. The forest is reduced from forest to wood. It is reduced to a natural resource. The Athshins are reduced to the creatures, these sort of semi-human beings. Enslavement, rape, oppression, these are built into that reductionism and are made possible by that reductionism as well. And also that the systems of oppression have to be built and have to be maintained.
I think what makes it a compelling narrative is because it's plausible, because on every continent on Earth, we've witnessed those things happen. So people from Earth doing that to another species on another planet is incredibly plausible because we've done it to ourselves on every spot on the Earth from one way or another. Even somewhere as small as Britain has had groups doing that to each other, or in Italy, over time. But then when the Europeans set out into the world, it really amplified that.
Yeah, for sure. It's something that we see over and over again, which is, I think, why it works as a trope in this fictitious book, that we can there see distilled the techniques that are used time and time again throughout history. So, Sam, why, to sort of wrap up, I suppose, why do we need speculative fiction? What is the benefit of talking about fiction here? Question posed at the beginning.
I think it's a reflection of us as a species and as a culture, and our time in space on Earth. When you read fiction, I think it's important to note when and where it came from. So in this case, you can find the clear allegory because you know who wrote it and where. It was in the U.S. In the midst of their own brutal colonization efforts, essentially. So in a way, fiction can turn into a sort of history for how certain people viewed the world and wanted to express their protest, right, in their writing. So I think that's one way, for sure, of why it's important. And we've talked about making a model out of situations or people in fiction at the start. I think fiction can provide a model of warning signs in a way as well, because it can show us where certain things can lead. I mean, how many alternate history fiction books have come out in the last 80 years where the rise of fascism occurs in Britain or the United States or somewhere, and it's so stark.
Yeah. But more than that, not just within sci-fi, I think that fiction can sometimes reveal the truth better than non-fiction can. I think Charles Dickens is an example of this. Oliver Twist is about poverty in Dickensian London, as is A Christmas Carol. He had a companion, Henry Mayhew, who made the case about poverty by using facts and figures and data. But we don't really remember Henry Mayhew. We remember Charles Dickens because he wrote these evocative stories, these evocative narratives.
Doesn't that name come up a bit in Dickens' work? That I feel like there's some characters named Mayhew.
Could well be. I haven't read a ton of Dickens. I've read Great Expectations and A Christmas Carol. I don't remember a character called Mayhew. I do remember that they were both characters in the Terry Pratchett novel Dodger, which is about the Artful Dodger. It's And here in the Netherlands, there is a famous author called Multatuli. His real name was Edward Douwe-Dekker. He wrote a novel called Max Havelaar, which exposed the conditions that in Indonesia when it was a Dutch colony under the East India Company. And he wrote this book, which to this day, every Dutch school child is required to read to graduate from high school. In addition to being credited with helping to drive popular support for the abolition of slavery in the Dutch colonies, it is also something that led to the development of the fair trade movement in agricultural products. Now, I used to work in that industry. I used to work for a fair trade adjacent organization, similar sort of thing, different brand. So it's not all it's cracked up to be, but that is not really the point.
Sounds like you worked for a Colonel Dong at one point, right? In that situation.
I kind of did work for a Colonel Dong. Yeah. That was pretty good descriptor, a pretty good, if pretty niche descriptor of the environment that I worked in when I worked in corporate sustainability.
Well, all of our listeners are in the know of that niche now. But I'd like to bring up a point about required reading. Because when you look at, American curriculum kind of varies state to state, but California, there are so many classics that American students are required to read that you'd think would teach these important lessons, like Animal Farm, like Of Mice and Men required, Animal Farm required, 1984 required in some classes.
Shakespeare.
Not as much as
really?
in
Okay,
Britain, for sure. But a lot of these classic, like dystopian, be careful of the oppressor and how they manipulate things, really promoting individuality in a lot of these books, and how to Great Gatsby, is also one. See, this is what I mean. I got so much history in here that I pushed all the literature out. But that's kind of my point, is so many classics like Fahrenheit 451, I didn't read until I was an adult, but I know so many kids that had in school, and they hated it at the time because they were 11. But reading it as, I don't know, a 24, 25-year-old, it stuck with me so much more. And I don't remember a lot of these classics and the themes that they had because it was forced on me at, I think, a bit too young of an age. It was just part of the curriculum that we had to knock out. And I'm sure they stuck with some kids, but I don't know. Is there a danger in assigning very important novels to kids a bit too young that aren't interested? Or is it better to assign those and hope it sticks with some of
It's a
them?
good question that I don't have a easy answer to. I know that that's basically a catchphrase on this podcast at this point. But I think that there is value to having some key books that people read. I think that questions of how those books are selected and who wrote them and why they're selected are important questions that we should keep in mind. But I think that, yes, there is a danger of things being assigned young and not being understood or appreciated properly. That often comes down to teaching, I think. But I do think there is some value to at least being aware of these texts. The danger is that it puts people off reading, which I think happens.
Which I think is a huge crisis in society. But I wanted to bring up, while we're on the topic of fiction, this is kind of a hot take in the current pop culture. Do you know the show Andor?
Yeah.
Have you seen it?
I've seen season 1.
Okay, so season 1 I loved. And this is relevant, don't worry. Season 1 I really enjoyed, and I think it hit that political messaging that, you know, the original Star Wars trilogy had, which was also a critique on the Vietnam War at the time as well. And that was essentially like World War II in space, that whole thing. And I felt like season 1 did a good job with political commentary. And season 1 came out under the Biden administration, which I think like critiques like that have to be a bit more nuanced when there is like a nominally left-wing person in office. Season 2 came out this year, and all I hear is a lot of liberals in America raving about season 2. And this is the hot take, is I was very bored by season 2. And a lot of people were just saying how amazing Andor season 2 was. And to me, it was just so like, it was so nail on the head against fascism that I was waiting for some undertones to come in and move the story along. I was like, oh no, we're just going to sit on this one planet being colonized this whole season. And it was just very, very on the nose. But then everyone's talking about it. Everyone here is like, wow, that's so amazing. And it just begs the question of, like, in general, does society have to be more on the nose with its fiction these days in order to garner favor with the majority of the public?
Well, it's a good question. You're familiar with FD Signifier? He made a video where he talked about The Boys, and it wasn't exclusively about The Boys, but it was around this topic, where, you know, The Boys was never particularly subtle, right? But season 4 was really not subtle in that, like, Homelander was very clearly a loser, and also very clearly more an analog for Trump and the MAGA movement in general in season 4. And, like, they were more on the nose because the show had been blamed for, I don't know, maybe glorifying it too much. I don't think that they particularly did that, but perhaps when you don't have high media literacy skills, it came across that way. And he was like, yeah, you know, maybe they need to be more on the nose of that. But then again, that is the worst season of the show. Of the 4 seasons, 4 is notably worse than the other 3. And his argument is like, you know, the problem is art reflects culture, and the culture that we live in is, and always has been, or has been for a long time, internally conservative, ultimately a conservative culture. And so the art is going to reflect that. And so what we need to do is to make art, make messaging, targeting people from really a young age. He had a guest on the podcast who I can't remember their name, but he called it counter-indoctrination, basically, where we create this messaging aimed at young people, which produces progressive values.
Yeah, and I don't want to turn this discussion into just, is society dumber than it once was? We've had that discussion talking about, like, Jimi Hendrix lyrics and stuff before, but I don't know. It just kind of feels like the lowest common denominator is the one being catered to in a lot of fiction these days, which it's probably always been that way. We grew up with like Fast and Furious movies and stuff.
Sure, to a degree. I don't think it's about intelligence per se. I think it's about capitalism. Surprise, surprise.
Okay.
Which
Elaborate.
Well, these products and/or the boys, these big popular products are ultimately products, right? They need to be marketed to as many people as possible. And the more you try and appeal to many people, the sort of flatter you have to make it, the more broad its appeal you have to try and make. And that means that ultimately it becomes less interesting because it becomes bland. And so you might need to make something for a smaller audience in order for it to be better.
AKA a book.
AKA a book. And I think that this brings us nicely to the final thing that I wanted to mention, which is how fiction and works of art can work hand in hand with protest, revolutions, and discontent. I think that fiction has the power to create reality. As part of this, I looked up inventions that came from sci-fi, that were inspired by sci-fi. Ultimately, the degree to which inspired by sci-fi is a fair descriptor. I'm a little bit unsure. Just because something happened doesn't necessarily mean it was inspired by sci-fi.
Okay, but one example is like something that as a young kid I didn't think would be possible, which is what we're doing now, which is like seamless video call.
Yeah, that's true. That's very Star Trek. And before then, well, the submarine, apparently, the American inventor Simon Lake, which is a great name for the inventor of the submarine. He was inspired by 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea.
Was that written before submarines were invented?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And the helicopter, apparently, in Clipper of the Clouds, Jules Verne created something like a helicopter, which inspired Igor Sikorsky, inventor of the modern helicopter. Apparently, and this is from Smithsonian Magazine, Sikorsky often quoted Jules Verne by saying, "Anything that one man can imagine, another man can make real." Atomic power, cell phones, tasers, again, video calls, these were all apparently inspired by science fiction. I think that part of why it's sometimes hard to get people on board with protest movements is that we say we have to save the world, we have to save the people around us from the horrors that we see developing. But people have been failed by the world. And so they say, well, what's so great about saving this? Better tear it all down and start again. I think that mindset is a big part of why Trump was elected, a big part of why Brexit happened, the idea that what's so great about all of this. And so I think we need to give people bolder visions to aim for. And that is why I'm very into solarpunk. Solarpunk is a literary and aesthetic movement that has now become a political movement, and that is utopian in its ideal. It promises what we can gain from combating climate change rather than just focusing on what we have to lose. But I think we'll talk about that in the next episode, which I run, which is going to be on utopian movements.
I'm looking forward to that because I feel like I've heard you describe solar punk a few times, but I haven't grasped it fully. So I'm looking forward to you breaking that down and drawing it back to protest and revolution. But yeah,
absolutely. It's so this is I suppose a book in which protest features, and which is a running theme throughout the book. Revolution is a theme throughout the book, and is useful insofar as it is a model for looking at very common tropes that happen throughout oppressive structures which necessitate rebellions, the impact that rebellions and revolutions can have on oppressed people themselves.
One thing that has stuck with me greatly in this series is our 5th preseason episode, The Tools of Oppression, where you broke down power dynamics, because I had never heard it described that way. But now when I look at anything, I'm structuring it through that lens. And I think this book most likely also explores that to a large extent when you're talking about power, where it resides, and and what is at play there with resistance, right?
Yeah. Its power is all around us, and how it can impact us cannot always be easy to unpick. To conclude, I want to take a passage from the author's introduction to The Word for World is Forest, where the Guin recounts a conversation with an anthropologist, Dr. Charles Tart, where Charles Tart asks Le Guin if she had used the Senoi people of Malaysia as inspiration for the Athsheans. She had not used them as inspiration. She had not heard of the Senoi people. But the Senoi people have the science of dreams down to a very high level, as high as Le Guin describes it, as high as Western cultures might have nuclear physics. The Senoi people have dreams. And so, to round us off, Sam, can you read this passage from Le Guin's essay in the front of The Word for World is Forest?
Breakfast in the Senoi house is like a dream clinic, with the father and older brothers listening to and analyzing the dreams of all the children. When the Senoi child reports a falling dream, the adult answers with enthusiasm. That is a wonderful dream, one of the best dreams a man can have. Where did you fall to? And what did you discover? The Senoi dream is meaningful, active, and creative. Adults deliberately go to their dreams to solve problems of interpersonal and intercultural conflict. They come out of their dreams with a new song, tool, dance, idea. The waking and the dreaming states are equally valid, each acting upon the other in complementary fashion. She ends the essay by repeating that question. Where did you fall to, and what did you discover?
Thank you, Sam, for recording with me. Thank you, listener, for listening. I hope you stay safe, look out for each other out there, and keep fighting the good fight.